This is the Eric John Phelps Show on 24/7 World Radio. And now, Eric John Phelps.
Welcome to the broadcast, Brother Eric John Phelps here with you today. And it's nice to be here on this beautiful Friday, January 4th, 2023. Thanks to the Jesuit order's wicked and sinful Gregorian calendar that was imposed on us historic white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nations in around 1754. And the abolition of the Julian calendar, which was more accurate and started the new year in a time of life when new things were happening, like in spring. The new year was in March. So one day, hopefully, we'll get rid of this Jesuit Gregorian calendar and go back to something more sane. And in the meantime, we'll just continue to expose it while we unfortunately have to observe that we are in a new year here in 2023. So again, welcome to the broadcast. Again, this is Friday, January 4th, 2022 with Brother Eric John Phelps. And after my broadcast on Wednesday or Monday concerning federal general common law and federal common law, I had a couple students contact me that said that they were kind of confused and they didn't have it clearly done or clearly proposed. Now remember, whenever you're a teacher and your student doesn't understand, it's your fault. It's not their fault. It's your fault. So it's my fault. So I apologize for that. And so I've decided to review what I gave on Monday and add a couple things to it, making it a little clearer, hopefully, Lord willing. But once you get it, it's very simple. And the blinders fall off. And you have a complete and total discernment of the jurisdiction that the federal courts are sitting in and the jurisdiction that the state courts are sitting in. And that's even more intriguing. And I'll get to that towards the end of this broadcast. You got to hand it to the Jesuits. They are the most brilliant, accomplished, disciplined, organized, erudite, patient men in the world serving a military order, a brotherhood, completely focused on their design. The end of the Reformation, the end of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Western civilization, the end of the white race to be miscegenated and race mixed with the blacks and Hispanics and Asians and everybody else so that we will not have a race anymore. And when you do that, you, of course, corrupt their churches because the churches in this country now today, all the Protestant churches are apostate. Most of the Baptist churches are apostate. So when the churches go apostate, what's to prevent the Jesuits from having a complete and total victory? Because as goes the church, so goes the state. As goes the church, so goes the state. First, you lose the spiritual power from the Lord, then you lose the temporal power of the God, the limited constitutional governments that he gave due to our obedience to his word. And that's exactly what's happened in Germany. That's what's happened in the Netherlands. That's what's happened in Sweden. That's what's happened in England, Scotland, South Africa. That's what's happened in Australia. That's what's happened in Canada. And that's what's happened in America. But it can be reversed. Of course it can be reversed. The Lord can do anything. But we need to know what the problem is before we can address it. So I'm going to attempt to review what I gave out on Monday, and I'll go a little slower. Hopefully a little clearer so that you will understand it. Understand is a good word. Forget this word overstand. That's ridiculous. A lot of our understanding, the Bible talks about in Ephesians. There's nothing wrong with the word understanding. So that we might have a clearer understanding or comprehension of what Satan's papacy by its Jesuit order has imposed on us here in America. So we're going to start again, and it's going to be a somewhat of a review of what I did on Monday, but then I'm going to clarify certain other things that I think were not clear. So, and this is from a somewhat similar prose I did, a somewhat similar article, but this is 12 pages, the other was 10. So if you're interested, I'll send this 12-page document to you. I'll be putting it in my advanced class here shortly. So when I teach my students jurisdiction, they have a total and complete understanding of what these courts do. And by the way, this would not be possible without the Bar Association. The Bar Association, unfortunately, the association or the organization is a criminal communist organization. It has been proven to be a communist organization in the past. And so with its monopoly in the use of the courts, proceeding in emergency war powers military jurisdiction on both a federal and state level, they keep you from being able to assert your God-given rights because they see you as clothed with an artificial person, a legal fiction, a person under the Emergency Banking Relief Act, amending Section 5B of the Trading with the Enemy Act. And in that Section 5B, they were called enemies. So the enemies became persons, these U.S. citizens. And hence, they have to take a man, a woman, and they have to clothe us or put a mask on us of a large artificial person. And that's the only way these courts sitting in emergency war powers military jurisdiction can proceed. They cannot see you. They cannot see the man. They cannot see the woman. These sentient beings, these God-created mankind, all they can see are legal fictions. And legal fictions need representation. And that's why you have the lawyers. That's why you have the Bar Association. Okay? Because everything is commerce and war. And hence, since everything is commerce, the emergency war powers military jurisdiction must proceed according to the course and mode of admiralty jurisprudence. Because admiralty jurisprudence is the jurisprudence that regulates commerce on the high seas. But when you bring that jurisprudence inland, you have to do it by way of a trick. That was pulled in 1938. And by the way, by 1952, all the states under war powers government will have imposed or passed the Uniform Commercial Code. The Uniform Commercial Code follows the maxims of equity. It governs commerce on land, and it sprang from the maxims of admiralty jurisprudence, which governs commerce on the high seas. So that's another thing that you want to remember. Uniform Commercial Code. Now, the Uniform Commercial Code is important because that means there's one code governing all commerce in every state. So if you're a businessman, you need to be able to count on a certain law that's going to enable you to conduct business. But it didn't have to be this way. So we're going to go back and we're going to talk about facts concerning federal common law. Okay, number one. Actually, there are two types of federal common law. Roman numeral 1. There is an old, quote unquote, federal general common law that was followed within the federal courts, possessive federal courts, Article 3, at law jurisdiction. Okay. A. That jurisdiction was exercised within a civilian due process of law. And to make it clearer, that jurisdiction was exercised within an Article 3 civilian due process of law. Remember, in the Constitution, there are 7 articles. The first article is legislative power. That's where we, the people, delegated our legislative power, our sovereign legislative power, to the Congress, to a House of Representatives and a Senate. That's called legislative power. As an aside, if you go into the House of Representatives, you will not see an emergency war powers military color flying in the House of Representatives, but what you will see are two symbols, fascist symbols called fasci, one on the right and one on the left of the Speaker of the House. Fascism is a military jurisdiction. So rather than fly military colors in the House of Representatives, they put up their fasci symbols, fascist symbols, which is a bundle of rods wrapped with a cord with an axe head protruding. And the axe head protrudes to the right or to the left, depending on what side that fascist symbol has been displayed. Well, in the House of Representatives, that's what they're flying. And that fascist symbol, those two fasci, were put there after the House of Representatives was renovated in 1951. Those symbols do not appear prior to 1951. And by 1951, the federal government has been an emergency war powers government since 1933. So that's 18 years. By 1951, there has been 18 years of emergency war powers military government in District of Columbia. And we're more correct to call it District of Columbia rather than Washington City. Okay. All right, going on. A. That jurisdiction was exercised within an Article 3 civilian due process of law. It followed English common law jurisprudence that had been developed within the American British colonies until the colonies became free, independent, and sovereign. That little description there, free, independent, and sovereign, is the phrase that you will find in the epic and pristine Dred Scott decision. There was nothing racist about that decision. It was a pristine decision, saying that, in effect, Dred Scott did not have status to bring suit in a federal court because he was black. Okay, that's just what the law said. And so within that decision, we see that the states were deemed to be free, independent, and sovereign. So don't let anybody tell you that the American colonies did not become free, independent, and sovereign states upon the signing and promulgation of the Declaration of Independence, 1776. Which we had then to defend with an American Revolution from 1775 to 1781 or 83. Okay, greatest revolution in world history, greatest, because God was involved in saving us from the British tyrants overseen by the Jesuits running King George III. All right, going on. So the states became free, independent, and sovereign with the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Declaration of Independence in 1776. Remember, it's only historic white Protestant nations that declare independence. That's the Netherlands, that's America, that's the sovereign state of Texas. Read Texas's Declaration of Independence and weep. B. That English common law jurisprudence of the colonies became the American common law jurisprudence of the 13 sovereign states. The state courts followed their at-law, quote-unquote, civilian due process of law. Chancellor Kent is clear on this as explained in his classic work, Kent's Commentaries, an American version of the English Blackstone's Commentaries. These were classic commentaries. The colonists used to read Blackstone's Commentaries. The colonists, many of the colonists, used to read, of course, the King James Bible. They read the works of Josephus, and they read Blackstone's Commentaries. Those were the three major works those farmers read before they went out and farmed. The Pennsylvania version is Sharswood's Blackstone Commentaries. And I have a copy. C. We the people improved the Articles of Confederation, or made a more perfect Constitution, by creating the Constitution of the United States of America. That document would have seven articles. We the people, quote unquote, would delegate our sovereign judicial power. Remember, in the Constitution, we delegated our sovereign legislative power in Article 1. We delegated our sovereign executive power in Article 2 by creating the office of the presidency. And we delegated our sovereign judicial power in Article 3 by creating the Supreme Court and then lower federal courts. So that document would have 7 articles. We, the people, would delegate our sovereign judicial power in Article 3, vesting that power with the Supreme Court. Article 3 also gave the power to Congress to create inferior federal courts that would also exercise the Supreme Court's Article 3 judicial power. Always remember Article 3 judicial power versus Article 1 legislative power when it comes to which jurisdiction or which powers these federal courts are sitting in. The Article 3 federal courts are either sitting in Article 3 judicial power or they're sitting in Article 1 legislative power. And as I will show you, we have not sat in judicial power since 1938. Not one case has ever been decided in Article 3 judicial power since 1938 with the Erie decision. I realize that's a monstrous statement, but if you disagree, you prove it. Tidewater talks about it, talks about judicial power, but it never says they were sitting in it when they gave that decision. And Tidewater also said, it's a 1946 case, I believe, that the Article 3 court considered an Article 1 legislative power, which was outrageous to certain conservative justices. That's what they're sitting in today. Article 1 legislative power, emergency war powers, military jurisdiction. Back in a moment, 24/7 World Radio.
This is the Eric John Phelps Show on 24/7 World Radio.
This is Brother Nicholas. Join me every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the German Bible Truth Hour and at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the Dutch Bible Truth Hour on 24/7 World Radio. This is Bruder Nicholas. Ich lade euch herzlich ein, mich anzuhören jeder Dienstag am 2 Uhr nachmittags, amerikanische Zeit, für die deutsche Bibelwahrheitsstunde und 3 Uhr amerikanische Standardzeit für die niederländische Bibelwahrheitsstunde am World Radio 24/7. Dit is broeder Nico. U bent hartelijk uitgenodigd om elke dinsdag om 2 uur Amerikaanse standaardtijd het Duitse Bijbelwaarheidsuur te volgen en 3 uur Amerikaanse standaardtijd het Nederlandse Bijbelwaarheidsuur te volgen op 24/7 World Radio.
This is 24/7 World Radio, and you're listening to The Eric John Phelps Show.
Essay, page 1. And we read paragraph D. The inferior federal courts exercising Article 3 judicial power would have 3 jurisdictions. They were, quote, in law, and that's historic Article 3 common law jurisprudence, quote, in equity, following historic Article 3 equity jurisprudence, quote, and, quote, of admiralty and maritime jurisdiction, following historic Article 3 Admiralty jurisprudence. Okay, this is all in Article 3, not in Article 1. Paragraph E, these distinct jurisdictions were separate and had to be specifically invoked by the plaintiff petitioner in the federal district court having original jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction means that's the first place you bring your case to. Okay, then you have appellate jurisdiction, then you have Supreme Court jurisdiction. So you first start your action in a court of original jurisdiction. The federal is called the district court. Okay. Each Article 3 jurisdiction had its own specific rules of procedure to follow. There were at-law rules, there were equity rules, and admiralty maritime rules. 3 distinct rule books for each jurisdiction. F. Over the years, from the Judiciary Act of 1789 to the Supreme Court's unanimous decision of Swift versus Tyson in 1842, the decision delivered by the great Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, a, quote, federal general common law developed within the civilian due process, Article 3 at-law jurisdiction of the district courts. The decision delivered by the great Supreme Court Justice spoke of a federal general common law developed within the civilian spoke of a federal general common law developed within the civilian due process, Article 3 at-law jurisdiction of district courts. So this first federal general common law was an Article 3 body of law. It was imposed in an Article 3 court sitting in Article 3 jurisdiction. We shall see that the new federal common law is exercised within an Article 1 emergency war powers military jurisdiction. So they're two separate animals. G, the Article 3 judicial power of the district courts was limited to 3 separate jurisdictions within 3 separate sets of rules of procedure, or with 3 separate sets of rules of procedure. The district courts could see the real man or woman unclothed with a legal fiction. Their names in the caption of each case were upper and lowercase letters. The district court sitting, quote unquote, at law, namely Article 3 American common law, could also see and uphold the common law rights of citizens, including the right to civilian due process of law. By the way, these citizens were pre-March 9th, 1933 private citizens. Okay, got to put that in there. Right, so pre-March 9, 1933 private citizens, including the right to a civilian due process of law as per the decision known as Hale versus Hinkle of 1906. H, Satan is ubiquitous. That means it's everywhere all the time, seemingly omniscient or omnipresent, but it's ubiquitous. Only God is omnipresent, okay? God has four attributes. He's omnipresent, he's omnipotent, he's omniscient, and he's immutable. And you can read about those attributes in the Bible as fully discussed in a certain theology proper work that I have by, what's his name? Louis Beard Schaeffer. Okay, H. Satan's ubiquitous Counter-Reformation Society of Jesus hated this limited Protestant constitutional republic of the United States of America. This hatred would include the Protestant Presbyterian Constitution and its limited Article 3 judicial power of the Article 3 district courts, including its historic Article 3 common law jurisdiction. Hence a plot or conspiracy. That's right, conspiracy. You don't like that word, you need to get over it. It's the CIA that came out with this conspiracy theory rhetoric back in 1948, thereabouts. They don't want you to know there's a conspiracy, especially the papal conspiracy, which is everywhere. Since a plot or conspiracy was designed to, 1, centralize power in Washington, District of Columbia, accomplished with the declared ratification of the Socialist Communists, Jacobin, Radical Red, Radical Black Republicans, possessive, 14th Amendment in 1868. The whole reason why the war between the states, War of Northern Aggression, was launched was to submit all of the states to centralized power in District of Columbia. That's why one out of four white men in the South were killed in that war. We're killing off those Democrats that believe in limited government. You can read about this in a book titled A Youth's History of the Great Civil War, 1861 to 65 by Horton, or published by Van Every. Going on. 2, create a government for the District of Columbia, making it a Rome on the Potomac. The phrase used, Rome on the Potomac, here was used by Justin Fulton in his great work, Washington in the Lap of Rome, written in 1888. Get it? Read it. He calls for D.C. Rome on the Potomac. That was accomplished with the District of Columbia Act of 1871. So the District of Columbia is now going to be the real capital, and it's located within Washington City. It will be a sovereign nation state on March 9, 1933, from which the commander-in-chief wages his war against the enemy belligerents of America that are living in the states deemed occupied territories. 3, do away with the circuit courts, centralizing jurisdictional power in the district courts, accomplished by the Judicial Code of 1911. And create the circuit courts of appeals, giving them only appellate civilian jurisdiction with the Judiciary Act of 1891. So they're changing the court setup, okay? They're preparing it for 1933 when they will be ruling the empire on behalf of the commander-in-chief, actually on behalf of the Pope. They will, number 5, bring the admiralty jurisprudence inland to the disruption of the American common law as was done in England by Charles I, working for the Jesuits. This outrage in England was one of the points of the Great Remonstrance, and there was, I believe, about 191 points of the Great Remonstrance that provided the reasons for the Puritan Revolution in 1642 to 1651, led by the good and godly and great Oliver Cromwell. Praise God. 6, oust the civilian government of the United States by imposing an emergency war powers military government. To do so, the Jesuit order would involve the Republic in a foreign European war, World War I, during which the Congress would pass its, quote, Trading with the Enemy Act on October 6, 1917. It would be later amended with the Emergency Banking Relief Act, quote unquote, on March 9, 1933, quote, would be approving and confirming, unquote, the establishment of said emergency war powers military government during this time of national banking emergency, which is equal to a state of war. They're identical. National banking emergency is still in place. Hence, the state of war is still in place. This Proclamation 2040 is still in place. Emergency Banking Relief Act that approves and confirms it is still in place. This would transpire on March 9, 1933, when the military government was established. Proclamation 2040, approved and confirmed by Emergency Banking Relief Act. 7, once the limited civilian government was ousted, and that's the word that's used in Berkheimer's Military Government Martial Law. It's a tremendous work. I teach it in my advanced class. And replaced with an unlimited emergency war powers military government in 1933 to then abolish Article 3, quote, Federal General Common Law, unquote. That's an Article 3 body of law, not an Article 1 body of law. Federal General Common Law practice and procedure that would include civilian due process of law, quote unquote, via the Jesuitical Erie decision of April 25th, 1938. Never forget, years ago, I went to the Lebanon County Court here, and I prayed about it. I said, Lord, I'd like to talk to a judge. So I went into the first door on the left, on the 3rd floor. Secretary sitting there. I said, my name's so-and-so. I said, would it be all right if I talk with the judge a little bit today? She said, well, he's kind of busy, but I'll go ask him. So he came out, and he said, what's your name? I told him my name. What do you want to talk about? Well, I'd like to talk about the law and a few decisions of the Supreme Court. He says, what do you do? I said, well, I'm also a researcher. He said, okay, we can talk. He says, but whatever we talk about, you're not going to repeat to anybody. I said, okay. So he took me in his back office. And that back office was a very plush office, and he had golf balls and golf clubs up there, and you could tell he was a golfer. And I began to ask him questions, like, who's your favorite Supreme Court justice? He says, well, I don't know. Marshall? Well, anybody knows of John Marshall. I said, how about Stephen Field or Learned Hand or Joseph Story? Or he said, I never heard of him. And I knew then I was not talking to a jurist. So I thought I'd bring up the Erie decision. I said, can we talk about the Erie decision? I think that's very important. He said, yes, it is. He said, with that Erie decision, everything changed. And it changed on a federal level as well as on a state level. And then we talked a little bit more about taxes. He said, well, I don't know anything about taxes. And he says, I think I'm getting dangerously close to providing legal advice. He said, so I'm going to have to end this discussion. So I had to go. But he gave me a couple of tidbits. So I went over to the law library, and I was looking around. It's up on the same floor there, I believe, third floor, second floor. And I found a series of law books. It was like, it's like Amjur or Second Corpus Civilis Secundum. It's an encyclopedia of law books. Okay? Encyclopedia of the law. Well, this was an encyclopedia of federal or state court decisions. And the name of the encyclopedia was, or reference work was, the Pennsylvania Digest. It's about 8 volumes, something like that. It's green. I'll never forget it. And as I'm looking on the cover, on the face cover of this particular first volume, it says Pennsylvania Digest from 1938 to the present. I flip it over and look at the spine of the book. Pennsylvania Digest, 1938 to the present. Everything changed in Pennsylvania law and jurisdiction in 1938 due to the Erie decision. And I will tell you what changed towards the end of this broadcast. This is very important, especially for any of you lawyers listening or any of you state court judges listening. You need to know this. Going on. We read. We talk about the Erie decision would overturn the nationalist Swift versus Tyson 1842 decision, as promoted for many years by the internationalist leftist jurists, including the socialist Yankee lawyer Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was an evil and sinister man, I would add, who wrote a tome, large work on the common law that he and the Jesuits secretly intended to overthrow. Oliver Wendell Holmes was tight with the Jesuits of Georgetown. 9. In the vacuum of abolishing civilian due process of law on a federal level, which included abolishing Article 3, quote, Federal General Common Law, unquote, Section 17 of the Trading with the Enemy Act would immediately fill the void. So when you abolish civilian due process, there has to be another jurisdiction waiting in the wings to be imposed. And that was the Trading with the Enemy Act, Section 17. So when civilian due process, aka Federal General Common Law, was abolished by the Erie decision, the Section 17 of the Trading with the Enemy Act filled the vacuum. And that's an emergency war powers jurisdiction, and it's military. Because the Trading with the Enemy Act is a war powers act having to do with war. War has to do with military. Congress shall have power to declare war. That's military, overseeing the military. So Congress passes Trading with the Enemy Act, and Section 17 would impose a military jurisdiction to enforce Trading with the Enemy Act for its limited purposes. So 10. TWIA was passed by Congress under its Article 1, Clause 8, Section 11 war powers conferred by we the people in 1789, and therefore the jurisdiction conferred on the federal district courts would have to be an Article 1 war powers military jurisdiction in the enforcement of Trading with the Enemy Act. So it's okay in 1917. 11. Section 17 of TWIA, codified today at 50 U.S.C. 4316, would be the special war powers military jurisdiction conferred on the district courts for the enforcement of TWIA. And TWIA brought in land would be brought in land by EBRA, Emergency Banking Relief Act. That would then bring essentially admiralty jurisprudence in land. So every state court could follow it too. To make that happen, Section 5B of TWIA had to be amended to be brought inland, making every enemy, quote unquote, now defined as a person, quote unquote, subject to this Article 1 war powers military jurisdiction that would proceed according to the course and mode of admiralty jurisprudence. Not admiralty jurisdiction, admiralty jurisprudence. Admiralty jurisprudence governs within admiralty jurisdiction. And admiralty follows the Jesuit order's beloved Roman civil law that they sought to replace the common law with Roman civil law. So 12. Once the Jesuits had imposed their quasi-admiralty due process of law on the district courts via TWIA, EBRA, and Erie, in Erie, decided by the Roosevelt Supreme Court on April 25th, 1933. So there's three things going on here. Trading with the Enemy Act, emerging with the Emergency Banking Relief Act, and the Erie decision. Remember, everything good comes in three, everything bad comes in threes. They now could combine the separate and distinct rules of civil procedure for Article 3 at common law, equity, and admiralty maritime jurisdictions into one set of rules, being the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. And I will add the wicked Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, imposed by the Supreme Court on September 16, 1938. That's 5 months after Erie. With Eric John Phelps, back in a moment, 24/7 World Radio. I'm going to have to... I read most of this Monday, so I'm going to cut through to some newer things that I've written for your clarification. Back in a moment, 24/7 World Radio.
This is the Eric John Phelps Show on 24/7 World Radio. This is 24/7 World Radio, and you're listening to the Eric John Phelps Show.
Reading of this essay concerning the federal general common law versus the federal common law. One is Article 3, the other is Article 1. But I'm going to go into how the Jesuits imposed that on a state court, on every state court. So going on, let me read. Paragraph 13. Once the newly imposed Article 1 legislative power, emergency war powers military jurisdiction of TWIA, as amended by IBRA, bringing Trading with the Enemy Act inland, and the new rules of procedure for this Article 1 war powers military jurisdiction imposed by the Roosevelt Supreme Court, quote unquote, a new Article 1 federal common law, quote unquote, could and would be created, highlight that, by the Article 3 federal courts sitting in this Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, emergency war powers military jurisdiction, proceeding according to the course of admiralty maritime jurisprudence. So to give the federal courts a monopoly in this military jurisdiction, the Supreme Court abolished the civilian jurisdictions of the court, of the district courts. And I had to find this out the hard way. As I mentioned to one of my students, I've been in federal district court 6 times at least. Last time I was in, I learned my lesson. The judge there, Judge Connor, when he replied to my motion for civilian due process, motion denied is moot. Motion denied is moot. This is the Middle District of Pennsylvania, the district court. Judge Connor used to be the Chief Justice there. Your motion for civilian due process, boy, cannot even be seen in this court, you stupid idiot. And you've been working on this for 30 years, fellas. The first time I was down that district court was, what, 2008. So it's been good, almost nearly 20 years. And I'm sure those judges down there thinking, well, maybe Phelps will get it right this time, maybe one of these days. Well, I finally understood. And I sent him a notice of thank you and appreciation for his decision, for his denial. Anyway, going on. We see here. Where did I live off? This would be done by a series of Supreme Court decisions making the U.S. citizens, quote unquote, that were created on March 9, 1933, with a seizure of every person, place, and thing here. U.S. citizens didn't exist prior to March 9, 1933. These hybrids composed of a real man, real woman clothed with a legal fiction. Okay. The U.S. citizens being TWIA enemies modified by IBRA to be persons subject to the arbitrary Article 1 legislative power of federal judges, they being no longer subject to immovable, limited Article 3 constitutional common law protecting fundamental common law rights by a limited civilian due process of law, common law procedure. Like I mentioned to you, I was in the federal court in Allentown, Pennsylvania years ago on a tax issue. I stayed out the common law right to work. Judge James Noel Gardner went in the back room, back in office, took over an hour to put all the authorities in place, and said, Mr. Phelps, you failed to state a claim upon which relief may be granted, Rule 12b-6, because we can't see common law in this court, you stupid idiot. I was starting to wonder, okay. He was right. He was nice. I liked him. Kind of a short guy. But there's no federal common law, federal general common law in those courts. There's no common law rights that any court, federal district court, can see or adjudicate about. Because there is no civilian due process there that can see common law rights. Going on. There is a new federal common law imposed after the Erie decision and now crafted by the federal courts. This new federal common law would be created through the federal courts sitting in Article 1 legislative power, not Article 3 power. The old federal general common law of Swift versus Tyson was Article 3 power. The newly crafted and being crafted federal common law is an Article 1 power, sitting in a legislative emergency war powers military jurisdiction. We go on. This new federal common law would be made by decisions of both the Supreme Court and the lower district courts. This new federal common law is not the old federal general common law of Swift versus Tyson. That Swift versus Tyson followed within the historic Article 3 civilian due process of law. B, the district courts in crafting their Article 1 new federal common law, quote unquote, could include state law, including state common law, which would constitute a new federal common law within their emergency war powers military jurisdiction, proceeding according to the mode and course of admiralty jurisprudence. 3 Supreme Court decisions concerning they were sent to me. I've addressed those, and I want to make the point here that when they're fashioning federal common law, they can pick from any jurisprudence. We'll take this out of admiralty here. We'll take this out of common law over here. We'll take this out of equity over here. Maybe we'll take some out of international law over here. The Supreme Court's doing that now. We can take anything we want because we're making an internationalist America with only privileges granted to them by the commander-in-chief with no common law rights. That's why they call it the Fifth Amendment privilege, not the Fifth Amendment right anymore. No federal district judge will ever call it a Fifth Amendment right. Going on. So all this new federal common law is being made after the Erie decision. Okay. So we go on and I read some excerpts as I read previously on Monday. And I'm just going to forego all those excerpts. And some of the high points I comment on are after paragraph 12. The new Article 1 War Powers Federal Common Law is crafted on a case-by-case basis. If the federal courts sitting in emergency war powers military jurisdiction on behalf of the commander-in-chief are not preempted, that's the little word they use, they will craft, that's another word they use, their developing subjective new Article 1 Federal Common Law that has nothing to do with the old Article 3 Federal General Common Law abolished by Erie. You guys with me? Is this making sense to you? So, conclude here with one of my comments. The new Article 1 Federal Common Law is crafted, resorted to, fashioned, applied, expanded, developed. These are all adjectives that they're using when they're explaining it to us. By the federal court sitting in Article 1 Emergency War Powers Military Jurisdiction. By the way, the paper that I reviewed on Monday, guess where that was published from? Jesuit St. Louis University. Yeah. See, the Jesuits are the masters of law. There's nobody greater than they are. They have the greatest law schools in the world. They got Georgetown Law. They got Loyola Law in Chicago. They got St. Louis University in St. Louis, Missouri. They have Loyola in New Orleans. They got Loyola in Los Angeles. The law, 1 out of every 10 lawyers in this country is trained by Jesuits. They're completely groomed to function in this emergency war powers military jurisdiction, proceeding according to the jurisprudence of admiralty. That's what they're all taught in law schools. Going on. The new Article 1 Federal Common Law is crafted, resorted to, fashioned, applied, expanded, and developed by the federal courts sitting in Article 1 Emergency War Powers Military Jurisdiction. They rule for the benefit of the military and commercial. Remember, everything is commerce and war. Everything. Ezekiel what? Ezekiel, I think it's 27, something. Ezekiel 26, everything is commerce and war. Every empire revolves around commerce and war. That was the Roman Empire, commerce and war. They had their troops garrisoned around the world, and everything was about Roman commerce, protecting their ships on the seas and their traffic on land. That's why we had the Roman highways and the Roman soldiers guarding the traffic on land. America is nothing more than a new Holy Roman Empire. It's the Roman Empire since March 9, 1933. For commerce and war to be used to destroy nations and reduce those governments to the temporal political power of the Pope. So when we send our military in, or the jackals in, or economic whores in to take over their economy or their corporations, they submit that government to the Pope. Their leader will be a papist or subject to the Pope. That's what the 20th century was about. That's why Al Pacino says in that movie, The Devil's Advocate, can anyone deny that the entire 20th century was all mine, all of it? And I would add, reducing all the nations to the temporal and political power of the Pope by controlling their commerce and by controlling their militaries. Just like it controls China's commerce and China's military, and Russia's commerce and Russia's military. That wouldn't be apart from the military government of Washington imposing those governments in those nations. Russia's not communist without Washington. China's not communist without Washington, overseen at the time by Francis Cardinal Spellman. Yeah. Going on. All is subjective. Nothing is in stone, as was the old Article 3 Federal General Common Law, followed within a civilian due process of law proceeding as per Article 3 at common law. This is why the Jesuit order had to make a go away with their criminal Erie decision. The question, remember, there was a debate going on for 20 years about Swift versus Tyson. What do we do with Swift versus Tyson? And finally, the bastards did away with it, using one of their Jewish Freemasons, Louis Brandeis, that traitor, to his own Jewish people and to the American people. Going on. This is why the Jesuit order had to make a go away with their criminal Erie decision. The question concerning abolishing federal general common law of Swift versus Tyson, having never been raised in the lower federal district court, evidenced by the Erie dissent or dicta. The question was never raised in the district court, in the court of the original jurisdiction. We need to do away with federal general common law and take that question to the Supreme Court. They never raised it. If they didn't raise the question, the Supreme Court cannot decide, but they did anyway, because they were a bunch of punks. The Roosevelt court was a punk court, working for the Pope, punking for the Pope, reducing America for the Pope with his Jesuit coadjutors. Louis Brandeis, Harlan Fiske Stone, that center. The Chief Justice Hughes, Cardozo, and others. Going on. Paragraph that I read on Monday, and I add, this is yet more subjectivity within the new ongoing fashioning of the Pope's new Article 1 federal common law, quote unquote, championed by Georgetown University Jesuits, including Viet Diem, a Vietnamese Roman Catholic working as a professor at Georgetown, fashioned the Patriot Act. The Jesuits out of Georgetown wrote the Patriot Act through their Vietnamese servant, slave named Viet Diem. I'm sure related to Diem of Vietnam War, who was a Roman Catholic, whose brother was the Archbishop of Hue, by the way. The Diem is a noble Roman Catholic Vietnamese family. And so this guy's here at Georgetown writing the Patriot Act to further enslave us here with this military government. Well, now I want to tell you about the Erie decision of 1938 affecting the state courts. This is most intriguing. Because remember, any state court you go into, now that's a county court, they call it a state court. They're flying the military colors of the United States, which is an American flag with 50 stars on it, with a eagle filial at the top, with gold fringe on 3 sides and or gold cords and tassels. That's a military color according to Army Regulation 840-10. They're also flying a state flag that's also a military color. Gold fringe on 3 sides, gold cord and tassels, with the filial generally of a spear. Pennsylvania, they fly a spear. It's military. So what's a state court doing sitting in a military jurisdiction? How in the name of Christ did that happen? Well, we're talking about now the new war powers jurisdiction within the state courts. The Jesuits knew it would be impossible to impose an emergency war powers military jurisdiction within the state courts by the state legislatures, enabling said courts to sit in a war powers jurisdiction. Remember, B, the states had developed their war powers delegated their war powers to the federal government via Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the Federal Constitution. That section states, Congress shall have power to declare war. Hence, the Trading with the Enemy Act was passed out of this provision in Article 1 of the Constitution. And the jurisdiction that was put in the Trading with the Enemy Act was a war powers military jurisdiction to enforce TWIA. But once you bring TWIA inside the country on March 9, 1933, now that jurisdiction can be imposed. We just got to get rid of the civilian due process. So we're going to do that 5 years later in 1938 with the Erie decision. And the jurisdiction of TWIA will now fill the gap, and every federal district court will sit in this military jurisdiction. But how'd they pull it off on the state level? Well, see, therefore, the emergency war powers military government newly created in the District of Columbia, March 9, 1933, had to have the consent of the state governors to agree to impose this emergency war powers government on the states. Every state is sitting in an emergency war powers government derived from federal authority. There is no state authority that could ever have imposed that in any state. D, with their consent, the governors imposed this federal emergency war powers military government on the states without the state legislatures passing an enabling statute imposing said war powers government. Remember, the state legislators did not have the state constitutional authority to impose a state emergency war powers military government. That power had been delegated to the federal government in 1789, as shown above. Therefore, the imposition of federal emergency war powers military government on the sovereign states ousted the civilian governments created by the constitutions of those sovereign states. That's what happened. Hence, the state republics, every state's a republic, are governed by their state governments, which are merely emergency war powers governments derived from FDR's Proclamation 2040 of March 9, 1933. Thus, the state governments are constitutional or civilian in form, but statutory or military in substance, due to the Emergency Banking Relief Act of March 9, 1933, approved and confirmed all the proclamations of the President and the Secretary of the Treasury from March 4th, 1933 to the present. Therefore, every state has been governed by an emergency war powers military government since March 9, 1933. Hey, you Texans, you need to get it. You got to realize this. Your state government is a military government put upon it by Washington, by the District of Columbia. You Texans think you're so independent? Wake up and see that you have a military government. It's a federally imposed military government on your state, but it is not a state military government. So every proceeding, whether civil or criminal, transpires in the state court with federal and state military colors on display. Every caption is in all caps the name following the jurisprudence of admiralty. And that's how this military jurisdiction overlaid the jurisdiction of the states. The common law and equity are still accessible on a state level, but this military jurisdiction has overlaid it, and you can get to those civilian due process jurisdictions. And I'll teach you that in my advanced class, my private citizenship class. So, Lord bless, and that does it for this particular topic. Back in a moment, 24/7 World Radio.